At the beginning of the triangular sawing method, we set the piece perpendicular to the vise. This ensures that we create a perfectly horizontal cut as long as we keep the blade of the tenon saw parallel to the vise. This is very important. It allows you to create a good, accurate saw cut. As previously talked in the previous video, it's very important to use your thumb as a guide to ensure you're creating a good, accurate saw cut. But ensure that your finger is away from the cutting edge to prevent injury. As you can see, I'm using the full length of the tenon saw, using the whole lot of the teeth. This allows the pieces of material to be removed as the saw is moving back and forth. This also prevents the saw from jamming and getting stuck in the piece. In this, we only saw down 5mm down the piece just to create a nice accurate horizontal line in which we can use for the development of the process. Creating this 5mm line, it creates a pivot point in which we can develop on and use as we continue out the sawing process. It's always important to cut the piece on the waste side of the line. As you can see, I've turned the piece at 45 degrees in the vise. This allows us just to focus on 2 lines at a time, and also it allows the saw cut that we've created with the 5mm down to act as a guide to help our saw cut all the way down to the line. When doing this process, it's very important to keep the saw parallel to the bench and the vise, as it creates an accurate, more precise cut. Why do we cut parallel to the vise? This allows the saw and our hand movement to stick in one continuous motion. It also provides good accuracy and precision throughout our sawing and doesn't involve any tilting of angles or movement along the piece. This is why it's very important to keep the saw parallel to the vise, as shown in the video. This also allows for a good accurate cut down the end grain, which we've already created, and also down with the grain. Once we have one side done, we can turn the piece over and position it in 45 degrees again. Once again, this is the same principles as previously talked about. This allows us to keep the saw parallel to the vise and focus on 2 lines at a time. This allows for the precision and accuracy of the lines to be correct and spot on if we use the saw correctly. It's very important to keep the saw parallel to the vise to ensure good, accurate, precision cut. The final process of the triangular sawing is to position the piece perpendicular to the vise. This finishes off the process to create a good, accurate horizontal line. Positioning it 90 degrees in the vise allows us to keep the saw parallel to the vise and create a good, accurate cut. This allows us to ensure that both shoulder lines are accurate on either side. This is why we turn the piece perpendicular to the vise so we can keep our saw parallel to the vise. This allows to create one smooth motion cut and also create a nice shoulder line in which we can use for the rest of our project. What would happen if you just sawed straight down the piece instead of using the triangular sawing motion? When doing this, you would find it hard to keep the saw perfectly parallel to the vise. As you are sawing straight down the material, you are sawing with the grain and could have a tendency to follow the grain. This is why it is so hard to ensure a good, accurate cut when sawing straight down. When sawing, you'd have a tendency to tilt the saw up at 45 degrees, trying to remove the material. This is very inaccurate and unpractical. It also means that we have to keep an eye on all 3 lines to ensure all lines are perfectly square to our cut. When using the tendon saw like this, it also provides a lot more effort than compared to when you tilt the piece. As we look at the saw cuts here now, you can see that when we sawed straight down a piece of material with the grain, you can see how the line followed the grain and went off our marking line, compared to our triangular sawing method where we have good, accurate, precise lines all the way around the piece. Processing a piece of material like this, the removal of the waste is the most important aspect as you finish off the joint. Here we are located with two waste points, one waste line which is the 5mm line from the top, and also our shoulder line. When removing the waste, it's very important to remove the 5mm line all the way through the piece, as you have the marking out lines to use as a guide. This is very important because when you're removing the 5mm at the top as your waste, it allows you to cut all the way through the piece. In this, I'm only cutting one section of it just for demonstration purposes only, but it's very important to continue your saw cut all the way along the piece, as you have the marking out lines to use as a guide and as reference points. Once you've that done, you can create your shoulder line at the other side. It is very important that you always cut waist-sided line to ensure you have good, accurate, precise shoulder lines. This is very important to keep the piece nice and tight up against the bench hook and create one smooth motion with your saw. After completing this process, it is very easy to highlight why this method is called the triangular sawing method. After removing the waste piece of material, you can clearly see the triangular shape in which this method creates in the middle of the piece. If sawn correctly, it should make a nice equilateral triangle from the very corners of the piece. So what would happen if we removed our shoulder line first before our 5mm waste? When removing shoulder line waste at the beginning, you're removing all marking lines and reference points in which we have created through our marking out process. This is very important that we cut our first 5mm waste at the beginning before sawing off our shoulder line. After sawing off both sides of our waist, we can clearly distinguish which side is the better processed side. We can see that the triangular sawing method is a lot more parallel to our two surfaces, which means this method is a lot more precise and accurate compared to when we sawed straight down the piece of material with the grain. You can see how the piece is not parallel to the surface or perpendicular to our shoulder lines in which we created. We can see that when we saw it straight down is off by a couple of millimeters compared to when we sawed with the triangular sawing method. This is why it's very important to use this method instead of creating the saw cut straight down.